The human is born out of the need for stress. When we have no stress, we have no incentive to performance. You grow by doing something you can't quite do. And in that moment, that stress exceeds your ability to cope and you grow as a result. Meditation is a hill to drive my body out of a state of stimulus into a state of calm. No one has ever lived in the world we live in today. The biggest single factor in creating a culture of inability to switch off would be something like 24-hour news.
If every guest could change 3 things to make their lives less stressful, what would they be? Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very excited for this, particularly because I want to reduce my own stress.
Crucial.
This is entirely selfish, this episode. How can I get like top tier Harley Street advice for free?
Is this for free?
Yeah, sorry. He's actually, his rate is very high. If you're having him on your podcast, you must pay a lot. So this is just entirely selfish, and I just want to know everything about how I can reduce stress in my life and just be a more in touch, less stressed person.
I think that's fair. That's fair. And the pressure's on me to be the most de-stressed person ever in this conversation.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
I'll ask later whether you ever get stressed being in stress management. I think that's probably a particularly interesting point. But for the people who haven't seen your work, can you give us a 3 bullet point intro into your career from when you started, biggest things you've done, what you're kind of most proud of? Whistle-stop tour. Whistle-stop
tour. I shall whiz through. I'm a physiologist, again, a not particularly well-known profession, but I was involved in health screening, and bullet point 1 would be trying to help health screening move from looking for disease to evaluating functionality. Mm-hmm. So let's not spend all my time checking whether you've got cardiovascular disease and whether you're about to have a heart attack or whether you might have a cancer. There's validity to that. But let me try and understand how you're dealing with stress, how you're dealing with sleep, how you're dealing with nutrition. So my role originally was in health screening, helping that move towards being more of a health assessment. So that'd be bullet point 1.
Yeah, very interesting.
And that really, just expanding on that, was trying to take things people think about as subjective. So we think about disease as quite objective. Have I got it? Mm-hmm. Haven't I got it? We think of functionality as quite subjective. How energized am I? Mm-hmm. Do I have good mood stability? Do I have good sleep quality? And I was really interested in how can we use technology as it develops to measure the things people think are subjective and put them into objective terms.
That's incredibly interesting. And did you kind of see that correlation between people who, for example, constantly had low mood or constantly were very highly stressed? Could you see that in their physiology?
Often. And physiology isn't perfect, mm-hmm. but in many cases, what we're seeing as a feeling is an expression of our physiology. We can think of a sort of classic condition like depression and say, well, we can treat that with something that recirculates serotonin in the brain. So that's fundamentally a physiological issue expressing as a mood state. Now, there's more complexity to that, of course, but really a lot of things people think are the way they feel are driven by how their body is working. Right. And I'm really interested in working, again, in health screening organizations to say, can we stop just looking at disease, but start looking at how we work? Because that's more interesting.
And do you think that's a nature of the fact that obviously for example, in the UK, the NHS is public, and so has access, everyone kind of has access to it. And so you're using it as a needs must service, of course, because we can't all be using it to walk in and be like, well, I want to know how to kind of sleep better unless we have a kind of condition that needs that.
Yeah.
I guess a function of that is then the fact that people look at medicine to fix their issues rather than to make better things that could be better from just being okay.
It's a brilliant description. Yeah, what we've got with the NHS is the greatest reactive healthcare service in the world, in my mm-hmm. opinion. I.e., when I go from the point where I'm not dysfunctional and I become increasingly dysfunctional, that might be given a name at some point, a disease, their job is to correct me back to not dysfunctional. Right. And they do that amazingly. So if I have someone, let's think of type 2 diabetes. Let's get technical early, but type 2 diabetes, a real problem because it's associated with being overweight and the obesity crisis. And when you get type 2 diabetes, it creates loads of secondary costs like blindness, amputations, and cardiovascular disease. It's a real problem. That develops over a period of time, which might present as signs, symptoms, and then dysfunction. The NHS is going to try and capture me at the earliest point it can and bring me back to the point where I have no symptoms or dysfunction. But if that was caused by me being overweight, if it was caused by me potentially eating a diet that's too rich in processed foods and refined carbohydrate, if it's caused by me being overtly stressed, if it was caused by these things plus genetics, it's not its job to correct those things. It's its job to take away my pain, take away the symptoms of high blood glucose. So we've got a system that hasn't got the resource to solve why the problem occurred in the first place. It's got to solve how that problem is presenting and debilitating my life.
And do you think developing that reactive system into a proactive system will be crucial to stopping things in the future? And do you think that's kind of possible with the current NHS?
I don't think it is possible. And I think we're asking it to do something it was never set out to do.
No, absolutely.
And people sort of rely on the NHS to make me healthy. The NHS can't take full accountability for an individual's health. And the danger is people perceive it's the NHS's job to make them healthy. It's the individual's job to make themselves healthy. When a state of health moves into dysfunction, the NHS will step in and bring you back. But we can't outsource the accountability for our health. And I think that's one of the challenges, because it's so good, we almost perceive it to be entirely responsible for our healthcare. And it's responsible for bringing ill care back to non-dysfunctional. But the role then of how I move myself away from disease. So if I take someone, and we often think of health as a continuum, it's not binary. You don't have good health, bad health. We're all on a sort of linear scale between gross dysfunction and flourishing. And that might be as a totality, or it might be individual systems. But what we've got to say is, it's my job to move myself towards flourishing. And really, in that role, we see the impact of lifestyle having a significant effect on physiology, which would move me closer to flourishing and further from dysfunction. But lifestyle is a bit of a wild west. And we know lifestyle medicine, the idea of using lifestyle to correct a medical problem, is growing. But I'm absolutely fascinated in the role of lifestyle to move us away from that problem ever occurring.
And following being in health assessment, where did you go next?
So after doing health assessments and then really working to scale assessments to a national, if you like, profession, so I helped develop the health and wellbeing physiologist profession in the UK. I then started with some colleagues, the world's most advanced health assessment. So the first thing was scaling up a good product, but then with anything you scale, you get more and more interested in who's doing the worst. How do I quality control the baseline? And we'd seen huge developments in technology, like DNA mapping had become much more cost effective. You can measure now through functional medicine laboratories pretty much anything you want to measure. I can measure hormones, you can measure the brain waves your brain's putting through, you can measure your digestive function, the gut microbiome, you can measure hormones, you can measure sleep cycles. So all this tech was arising, but there wasn't really a product to embed it into something that was usable.
Right.
So with some colleagues, I set up on Harley Street to deliver the world's most advanced health assessment and evaluation service, which is a bit of a mouthful. And that product...
It's so catchy.
It's so catchy. And that product was really to say, how would you look after an individual if resources weren't finite? And the main resource being money. So if you took an individual who had a significant amount of money and you wanted to answer 3 key questions, could there be something wrong with you, Grace? That's the first question people have. And they think health is, well, if I'm not ill, then I'm well. Fine, and of course, that isn't necessarily true. But to exclude something underlying and sinister is worthwhile. And we know it's unlikely most people have something wrong with them. High net worths want to prove that to be true. Why would I assume when I can prove? Steve Jobs assumed he didn't have pancreatic cancer. He did have pancreatic cancer. So if he had done some advanced screening, again, possibly not available at the time, then that might have changed the direction of his life.
It's so interesting because this obviously is a hugely important and hugely interesting part of kind of us being able to understand ourselves. And yet it obviously then creates even more of a schism between people who are able to afford something like that and people who in the UK, thankfully, can rely on the NHS to be able to fix their issues. Yeah. If we look at, say, like an American healthcare service, that is based off the idea that you can't get either of those things for free, which is horrendous, in my opinion. Yeah. And so are having to pay for both of those things. In the UK, if we're able to be provided with fixes, which is fantastic, and as we should be, but certain members and sections of society are able to essentially like unlock an even more kind of, a more advanced view that actually ends up increasing life expectancy, increasing their quality of life, all of these things. Yeah. How do you kind of feel about that in terms of I know you've moved away from the health assessments and in kind of that way at the moment, but I can imagine that poses quite a strong moral question in terms of, this is incredibly interesting and we're advancing things, but actually why does X person get to know that they have cancer way before another person
Totally.
does, because they're in a completely different financial position?
I think it raises an enormously pertinent question. It's a difficult one because ethically, when you're anyone involved in healthcare, you want sort of a democratized solution.
Absolutely.
I think interestingly with that particular business, it's probably the first time all those different variables have been put together in one pot. And you're asking the question, what can I learn from this that can be democratized?
Yeah.
And I know that business, which still runs, is very keen on how it becomes a learning hub about which tests are useful, which ones aren't.
People pay for things, we'll run them, and then we can hopefully learn from this and apply this to a greater.
Because you don't have, clearly within screening, it's a really difficult socioeconomic argument because with screening, you'll get false positives. So we look at mammograms, which are available through the state system. They'll be contentious because some people will get a result where it says they have a problem and they don't. And you create anxiety with that. You create additional cost in terms of chasing down the rabbit hole. So the question with every test is about whether it's effective as in terms of too many false positives, also too many false negatives. It tells you don't have breast cancer when you actually might. So screening itself is contentious, let alone at the very top level. I think screening is something that again, ethically, the people who'll be able to do that are not going to affect sort of the baseline care. You almost say people who are excluding themselves from the healthcare system are then decreasing a cost that might be shared by others. You can make an argument both sides for it. But I think the real question is what you can learn when you don't put boundaries around healthcare. And ideally, you'd say, actually, we've realized that the 3 most important tests out of 10,000 you can run are these 3. And then how might that then...
And therefore, how can we give more access to that?
Screening is one part of the health assessment. So it's probably the most contentious part, saying, is there something wrong with an individual? Yes or no. But there's also quite good screening available through the NHS.
Oh, absolutely.
But that product, would really find its value in prevention. And prevention isn't finding a disease before it kills you. It's finding a body that's becoming dysfunctional before it classifies as disease.
Yeah.
And then equally driving into the physiology of how someone works and saying, can I make you feel better?
Yeah.
And all those things are really trying to stop the individual becoming unwell and then driving into a healthcare system where we're all sharing the same cost.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's incredibly interesting. And you moved from this background or not necessarily moved, but kind of increased on what you were doing in this background of physiology and moved to kind of stress and lifestyle management.
Yeah.
Firstly, why did you do this? As in, why did that seem like the next kind of best step for you?
Yeah.
And also, I'm really interested in whether you think that we see stress management and these kind of lifestyle management terms as quite wishy-washy, whereas actually, as you've said, they're almost based entirely on, the science of it.
Totally. I think, I came out of that business very happily, and it's still doing brilliantly. But I think that for me, what was so interesting is the impact. So let's imagine I'm doing that assessment on you, and we've got, let's say, 10,000 results, everything from blood, saliva, urine, stool, always fun, brainwave analytics, DNA, everything. And then I improve your body's ability to move, and I improve your body's ability to nourish, I improve your body's ability to recover, and let's put stress into that recovery piece. Then you'll see an improvement in almost every one of those results you've measured. So what you've got to be careful of with healthcare is you don't get too fixated on looking at the leaves of the branches and not the root of the tree. And for me, lifestyle has often been a little bit wishy-washy. And I think lifestyle, well-being, these aren't brilliantly well-defined terms. And they sit almost in the sort of the aesthetic industry. Well-being, the biggest contributor to global well-being is skin creams. But if I think of well-being as the sum of actions that impact on my physiology, if I improve how your physiology works, I will see an improvement in every parameter that we can collect and measure. Including your skin. Including your skin. And the body isn't such a reductionist approach that I can change one thing and your skin suddenly blossoms. Because your skin will be a function of how your gut works. Your skin will be a function of whether you're nourished, whether you sleep, whether you move, whether you are exposed to tons of environmental pollution, whether you wear SPF 30 to protect yourself from the sun's rays. So we try to reduce outcomes to one single thing in equals the outcome I'm dreaming of. And that works well for a product marketplace. So someone can sell me a cream that will solve all my problems. But that's not how physiology works. So I think I got really interested in saying, well, actually, if we're measuring the ripples of lifestyle, why not go and try and make people better at curating lifestyle? And within that, stress is a major piece. And in fact, stress when I first started, in health screening was a sort of conversation that was almost separate to the health screen. The screen was saying, Grace, have you got heart attack, happening? Have you got cancer? Have you got some organ dysfunction? And people would be proven, no, they don't. And then they'd go, oh, but I don't sleep well, and I've got this sort of tight chest, and it's not a heart attack, so it's fine. And the manifestations of stress, everything from, from tight chest, poor sleep, up to poor digestion, difficulties with skin. And we're seeing stress manifesting in almost, every health problem people will cite. And the contribution of stress to ill health is rising with sort of every journal and study that comes out. So that was really interesting to me for an issue that's perceived as psychological. Mm-hmm. So, most people think of stress as, a pressure of the mind, and the definition of stress is when the pressures incumbent upon us exceed our ability to cope. That's a sort of simplified version. So people always think of that as being a mental issue. And the biggest professionals in the stress space would probably be psychotherapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, people who try to change either the way we think or the way we view the world. Mm. What I found really interesting, right back from the 1930s, just before I was born, is that there was an endocrinologist who stressed rats, and he found that they got stomach ulcers. He stressed them by sort of electrocuting them and doing all sorts of mean things.
The usual stress.
The usual sort of stress. Yeah. But he created a stress, and in those rats, he found ulcers. Their thyroid gland wasted away. Mm-hmm. They had an enlargement of a gland called the adrenal gland, which makes cortisol and adrenaline. And that was really interesting because the stress he was giving them had nothing to do with those organs. And at that moment, stress went from being a psychological issue to a physiological issue. I.e., if my body, my emotions, my mental state is overwhelmed, it will turn up in my physiology. And a lot of people, when they're excessively stressed, are given something like a beta blocker, which is a medication that stops adrenaline acting on your system. Or they're given a muscle relaxant that takes away the physical manifestation, and that changes their ability to deal with stress. And I was absolutely fascinated by that, and the idea that if you block the messenger of stress, you change the way we view the world and you change how functional we are. And my interest as a physiologist has been, how does a thought turn into physiology that turns into dysfunction, and how do we intervene with that more effectively?
That's so interesting. And when you're meeting a patient, for example, for the first time, how do you evaluate their stress levels and kind of how they're able to deal with stress?
It's a great question. There's no single test for stress. And your biggest...
Are you doing it on me right now?
I am. I started when I got in.
Am I stressed?
You're doing magnificently. But the
Surprising.
idea... I think the first thing with stress is enormously positive. Mm-hmm. So the human is born out of the need for stress. We start with the idea that stress is when the pressures upon us exceed our ability to cope. That's not technically the definition of stress. That's the definition of distress.
Right.
When we have no stress, we have no incentive to performance. If we think of exercise, that's a stress on your body goes, oh, that was something I couldn't quite do. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll increase my capacity. So the same thing in 2 days' time hurts me less.
Right.
So same with growth. With setting up a business, you grow by doing something you can't quite do. Right? And in that moment, that stress exceeds your ability to cope and you grow as a result. So we have to be careful when we talk about stress that the word itself is not negative. It's extremely positive. But if we face a prolonged exposure to pressures that exceed our ability to cope, we move into distress, and that's when the body starts to fall apart a little. So the first and most important thing is always the story of the individual. Mm-hmm. So there's no data that's going to override what you're telling me about the way you feel, and that way you feel will be everything from mood state to digestive health to bowel habits to all these other bits. So we can do a sort of subjective quantification. What's really interesting for me is the main mechanisms of why people seem to get unwell from stress seem to be through two biological systems. There's a nervous system that runs the inside of you, as much as people don't like to think about this. So I've got my motor nervous system that controls, whether I'm moving, dancing, etc. Not often. And I've got my autonomic nervous system that basically runs the inside of my body. Right. And that nervous system's got two key arms, one that speeds up your physiology and one that slows everything down. And you've probably heard the phrase fight or flight. Mm-hmm. So you've got a nervous system that prepares your body for fight or flight, but it's not a binary state. You don't suddenly go from 0 to being able to jump out the window to escape an attacker. But you've got a nervous system that speeds up your physiology, and you've got a nervous system that slows it down. And in many cases, the human being is a bit of a battery. We have a nervous system that expends energy, the one that speeds everything up, and we have a nervous system that slows it down. It's called the sympathetic to speed up, parasympathetic slow down. From the 1970s, we knew if we measured something called heart rate variability, we could quantify whether a person was being predominantly run by the speed up system or the slow down system. So I'm going to put this in layman's terms. We can sort of measure whether an individual over 24-hour cycles is spending too long prepared for stress or too little time prepared for rest and digest. And that measurement became really interesting. And in fact, that measurement sits behind technology like Whoop, which I wear. People who wear a Garmin watch will have an algorithm that tells them when they can train again. Apple Watch has a component of it, or a Ring. And we've seen this technology move into the mainstream without people quite understanding exactly how it works. But heart rate variability gives me an analytical measure of whether your body is spending too long prepared for stress. That is a gross oversimplification that will get me pillared online. But principally, that is what we're looking at. When I first started measuring executives, probably right in the early 2000s, I thought by measuring heart rate variability, I'd find them super stressed because they were telling me they had symptoms of distress. They weren't sleeping well, they had poor immune system, their sex drive was down. Those are the things that they're reporting. So that sounds like chronic stress. What's interesting when you measure heart rate variability is we found often they weren't in a state of perpetual fight or flight, but they had inadequate rest and digest.
Okay.
So if I was going to simplify that again, I'd say the sort of modern executive is not excessively stressed. They are inadequately recovered, which manifests as the same thing. It's the same thing.
So is that things like when we relate that back to something like hustle culture, for example, when we're essentially encouraging this kind of like all work, no sleep, this is the way you succeed, all of that. I can imagine that then stress isn't the fact that the things in those days are too much. It's the fact that you haven't had enough space between those days and those hours working to be able to cope.
Totally. Yeah. And really, you'd say, how many people are excessively stressed? Most people, if we look at a real stress situation, what's going on in Ukraine, or, a real life or death, famine, war, actually, in many cases, people who've just given birth to children, real periods where it's, extremely switched on. You can't switch off because there's a risk to your life. That's quite different to someone who's, dealing with an unmanned number of emails, who's rushing between one thing and the next. They're not the same level of threat. But what they are is a continual reminder that you can't switch off. And no one has ever lived in the world we live in today. I would say the biggest single factor in creating a culture of inability to switch off would be something like 24-hour news, maybe even before social media. My ability to deal with pressures, is down to my emotional coping, my mental coping, but my physiological coping. Whoever said that I could deal with seeing children dead on the street in Ukraine while I'm trying to run a business, while I'm trying to manage my home, whilst my elderly parents are not well? We're adding something into our lives that we were never designed to deal with.
So do you think that is then a very strong case for also, we talk about not working at the weekends, for example, and being able to design a 5-day work week, which arguably has its problems in itself, but that gives us this respite at the weekend. If then our current lifestyle means that we spend that weekend then not working, but our mind is constantly consuming news, whether it's gossip, whether it's your favorite influencer, whether it's your friend from school getting married, all of these things that you kind of constantly see then on social media bombarded at you in a kind of at a rate that we could never have possibly imagined before social media.
Yes.
Do you think then there's a case for being able to give yourself total respite from all of these different things?
It's a challenge. So, and we're seeing, because the world is continual stimulus, we have a hyper stimulus problem. We would look at people's brains and see the brain had become hyper vigilant. So it's always looking for its next fix. It's always looking for the next thing to worry about. When we see people who've had a trauma, why they've got heightened stress and anxiety response, they're looking for the next thing. Right. That previous experiences means they're looking for stress. A good example of that is if I have someone who's myself, I used to have a fear of flying. So I'd be on a plane and everyone is going through the same thing as me, but my previous bad flight has meant I'm listening to the engine because I think it's going to crash. And so I'm actually turning my physiology into a plane crash, not a plane flight. And that's why my heart rate goes up, my palms start sweating. I'm hyper vigilant because of something that happened in my past that changed the way I view the current and the future. So I'm living in the future effectively.
So then in the everyday, with this being kind of the reality of, first of all, the world we live in now with things like social media and 24-hour news and constant connectivity, and the idea that we need to be working far more than we ever did in kind of industrial revolution times, for example, what can we do then to bring ourselves or to be able to reduce that stress whilst living in this world? Because it's not like we can just be like, oh, okay, well, I'll just fight against those multi-billion-dollar tech companies that are vying for my attention and just ignore it.
Yeah.
the reality is that's not going to be the case most of the time.
Exactly right. And we have to live in the world we live in. We can't fixate on what happened in the past. And again, we add into stimulus light exposure, we add into stimulus noise exposure. We as a sensory, machine are constantly bombarded. And we've got to take the idea that going into recovery is not just the absence of stimulus. So if I turn everything off, that probably won't give my body a clear chemical message or message to go into physiological recovery. And out of this, we're seeing the rise of activities that seem to help my body transition to recovery. So why is meditation generated 2 unicorn businesses, in Calm and Headspace? Because, meditation is if you like, a pill to drive my body out of a state of stimulus into a state of calm. Now, that may be through its action on my brain's ability to focus on one thing, or more likely the regulation of my breathing, which is one of the most powerful ways to move me into calm. We know Wim Hof. I don't know if you know the Wim Hof method, but as sort of he's a gentleman who's pioneered cold water breathing therapy, and it's become extremely popular for people as a form of therapy, as a form of de-stressing, people who've suffered from burnout, etc. If you add cold water to human physiology, it slows our metabolism down and puts us into recovery because my body's trying to preserve its energy, preserve life. And if you get me slow breathing while in cold water, you have, again, a very condensed pill for activating recovery. And I think we've got this idea that everything is stimulus. So now we need deliberate mechanisms of driving me into recovery, of which breath work is powerfully almost number one. Because as I breathe, I drive my physiology into recovery. And that's why, again, we see methodologies of breathing that slow the exhalation, that try and get us breathing not from the upper respiratory, but from our diaphragm, from our belly. If I breathe slowly from my diaphragm, I pull on a nerve called the vagus nerve that fundamentally drives me into recovery. So even if I'm on that plane and my brain has decided, oh, this plane's going to crash, and my physiology is getting ready for a crash and the bereavement and all the horror of it, I can come out of that by slowing my breathing, which is why, again, it's a very powerful way of getting out of a panic attack, which is where that loop has got itself out of control. So we've got modern day solutions would be things like meditation, things like breathing, things like cold water therapy. The biggest probably single reset would be my movement. And we have to, again, to factor in, not all movement is equitable. Movement has been reduced into a calorie exercise. So I move to burn calories. I do my 10,000 steps to burn calories. I train 3 times a week to keep my weight under control. Movement is the lifeblood of physiology. Right? When I move, I recalibrate my internal physiology. I move, and that shakes digestion. It shakes my digestive system. It helps me literally wobble poo through my bowel. A lovely image. I'm sure.
So nice.
So lovely. So glad you had me. I got.
Hope no one's eating.
I hope no one's eating. Put it down. But if you've eaten something and your blood glucose is going up, the carbohydrate turning into sugar in your bloodstream, as you move, it comes back out again. So we have a different response to glucose. We have a different response to digestive health. We have the fact that my body is pumping blood down now to my legs. How's it getting from my legs back up? Partly under blood pressure, but partly under muscle pumps. So I need those muscles to squeeze my blood like toothpaste up a tube. So everything from my circulation to my glucose control to my digestion relies on movement. But equally, the more I move, the more I'm able to go into recovery, because that's what my body loves. When I train, I don't obviously get fitter from training, I get fitter from the recovery from training. So when we see people do cardiovascular exercise, when they increase their cardiovascular capacity, we see a greater propensity to move into recovery. So one of the reasons why someone, let's imagine we've got 3 people lined up next to each other, all relatively good athletes, running a 10K. The person who is the fastest will probably have the lowest resting heart rate. Again, very generalized. That's not just because their heart is larger. It's because the nervous system that slows heart rate down is more dominant in them. Okay. And that's the same nervous system that, again, we're talking about with recovery. It's called parasympathetic. So, my mechanisms to say, how can I combat modern living, which is the reality. The path of least resistance for someone now is to get ill. It is a they coined the word obesogenic environment years ago, which said you're likely to gain weight, and you're likely within that to get the diabetes. So obesity plus diabetes. These are the likely things that our environment is driving us towards, because everything's labor saving. If I go to any tech conference, it means I used to have to get up to change the remote. Now I can shout at something. I used to get up to order food. Now I can holler at a device. So everything is decreasing our movement quality and volume. Everything is allowing us to eat more hyper-processed, highly palatable foods that are low in nutrients, etc. Everything is telling me to stay stimulated all day long. I know most teenagers go to bed with an iPad, which is totally counterintuitive to human physiology that requires darkness for sleep. So the environment is making us more likely to fall over. So we then need to find cheats, if you like, to sit in that. So if that is my lifestyle, can I, meditate? Can I move? Can I use cold water therapy? Can I manage my chemical inputs that directly affect my stress, of which the two big ones would be caffeine and alcohol? Interestingly, and again, people will be sort of saying, please, Ollie, don't talk to me about caffeine.
Bottle of vodka and my coffee down
well,
here.
I thought that was a strange addition to the thing. But caffeine, caffeine is a bit of a catastrophe. It's sort of a chemical stress. If you have 10 espressos, you have that sort of crushing feeling of anxiety, because caffeine acts pretty similarly to adrenaline, which would drive that sort of hyper-stressed state.
It tastes so good.
It's so delicious. And trust me, I love it. But the biggest challenge you've got, again, if someone is saying, I'm not managing my stress well, and they're dosing in on caffeine, they are putting petrol on the flames. The biggest lifestyle factor that seems to exacerbate all this is the misappropriation of alcohol as a de-stressing factor.
Right.
So if I watch any good quality ITV drama.
Or just me at the weekends.
You at the weekend, right? But you at the weekend, that's different, right? So let's imagine you on a Tuesday night, you've come home after a hell of a day.
Right.
Now, if I watch, some drama, the protagonist will get home, open the fridge, get out, a sort of bottle of white wine, pour a glass. It looks amazing.
It does.
And you can see them sort of go,
Yeah.
Now, if I'm in that hyper sort of vigilant, stimulated sense, my sympathetic nervous system's driving me all day long, I will breathe a little more upper respiratory. I will hold more muscle tension, and that will mean I've got a sort of sense of tension here, which is why I love a massage. Don't get them at home, but I'd love a massage. I can't get a massage at home. So if I drink alcohol, it's a muscle relaxant. So it basically gives me that feeling. Right. But neurologically, it's not a relaxant. It will stimulate me, which is why if I drink too much, I go out till 3 o'clock in the morning and dance on a table. Yeah. It's not a suppressant. It's a muscle relaxant. So it's dressed up as a stress reliever, but it's actually exacerbates stress, kills deep sleep, and is the biggest, probably wrong use of a stress aid in the modern world.
So what I should do when I get home, just so I can take notes on this, is I should get in the door. Yep. I should breathe really deeply.
Love it.
I should then get in a cold bath.
Amazing.
Turn my phone off.
Amazing.
And sleep.
You can't go to sleep at 8 o'clock.
In the bath.
Not straight away. Get out of the bath.
Yeah.
I think, one of the most important things is the body needs some kind of boundary when it knows it can move into recovery.
So kind of a evening hygiene type routine.
So sleep hygiene has grown in concept because absolutely my brain needs to understand that it can let itself go into deep sleep where it's fundamentally not listening to the world. Mm-hmm. But if I have, again, the blue light thing's slightly different, but if I've asked my brain to solve problems, if I've asked my brain to see something highly adrenalizing, like I watched Ozark on Netflix, that's not good pre-bed, watching. So you've got these things that are asking me to solve problems, and then I'm expecting my brain to go from a stimulated state to go into deep sleep where it's really disconnected from the world. It won't let me go there. If anyone's had a child, then they're listening for that child in the night, and they kill deep sleep as a result because you're desperately wanting to hear that they're breathing and they cry out for you. You can't go into deep sleep if you're waiting. But if you've ever taken an early morning flight, right?
I was about to say that. Last night, because I knew it was a very early morning, and I'd been out to dinner and gone to bed later than I would have otherwise. Yes. And so I went to sleep and I was like, God, it's going to be a hard wake up. And I just woke up every single hour because I just thought that alarm's going to go off and I need to not miss it. Totally. Not that I've ever even missed an alarm in my life. I do not think I've ever slept through an alarm. And yet every single hour, the podcast.
Totally. And it's a real thing. So your brain is going to let itself, it's going to protect you, right? So if it feels there's a threat, and it can't distinguish between you getting up early to make a flight to meet a podcast versus you being at threat of some kind of war-based attack.
Right.
So
very different.
It won't let you go into a state of sleep where you're vulnerable. Mm-hmm. It's protecting you. Okay. So and if we don't go into deep sleep, particularly in those early hours, which is where we get most of our deep sleep. So deep sleep, slow wave sleep, within there we drive our immune system regulation, which is amazing. We consolidate memory, our creative brain, all sorts of fantastic things go on in deep sleep. If I have been unable to convince my body that there's nothing it needs to worry about, if I've been, and if I've used alcohol, those two things will stop me going into that deep sleep.
So how do we convince our bodies that there's nothing to worry about overnight?
to trick it. And in many cases, one of the key things with that is, how can I focus on an individual sense? So things, massages, of course, a great example. No one's going to have a regular massage every night. I think, there's often that ability to create a physical transition between work and play. So a sort of evening shower can work really well. I've just got a fly, trying to add to my
get some advice.
stress. And a fly's got such a short lifespan, I wouldn't dare. But within the world of transitions, if people are working from home, do they change clothes when they finish work? Do they have a shower? I have a different scent in the morning, a sort of, a very citrus-based scent, and then a lavender-based scent in the evening. I need to create something that tells my physiology that I've changed work. We know the old adage, I used to, work from home. Now I live at work. It's sort of the spin on that. So if we're working from home, or if we're at a home where we need a transition, clothing, a shower, hot bath can work really, really well with different scents. Exercise is still probably the most powerful modulator of transition. So at the end of the day, if my body's been building itself into that heightened state, some kind of exertion is beautiful to reset my physiology.
Yeah.
Now the question there would be, do I go and slaughter a punch bag, which would be sort of high intensity interval training, which is a highly adrenalizing activity, or do I go for low intensity steady state, which was damned a few years ago because it wasn't deemed effective at massively changing fitness or burning as many calories. But when we repurpose the idea that exercise isn't always about calorie burning or progression, we can use low intensity steady state cardio. It could be a swim, that could be, a hard walk, it could be bike riding. And we use that as a way of saying, right, over the course of the day, I've built up this stimulus pot, and now I need to somehow decrease my body's alertness. And if I exert myself, that's a really great recalibrator. So I'm seeing a lot of people, again, who are hyper stimulated. I've seen this for 23 years. Highly stimulated in a sort of perpetual switched on state, who then try and sort of slaughter themselves in a high intensity gym environment in the evening, finish that off with a glass of wine while watching Netflix, and wonder why they're exhausted the following morning.
Right.
And so there are loads of things we could talk about in practical sense within that, but your biggest ones would be, some kind of physical transition between work and play. Play is extremely valuable. Fun, humor. Am I watching something humorous, not something dark and distressing? Lower intensity exercise. It could be yoga, Pilates, could be low intensity cardio, avoidance of alcohol, and then some kind of transition between blue light and red light. And how do I allow my body's natural mechanism of moving into recovery to be facilitated?
So essentially creating a kind of cycle of prompts for morning versus evening can go a long way in terms of reducing our stress and helping us sleep.
Enormous. And you've spoken to lots of entrepreneurs and business owners. Routines matter. So a morning routine is extremely important. From a stress and hormonal management point of view, we love first morning light exposure. So in that first hour to get outside and actually allow our eyes to sort of have natural light on them. That helps regulate our circadian rhythm. So we've got these two hormones sort of fighting for control. Cortisol, which we pump out in the middle of the night about 4 o'clock, and that drives our energy state in the morning, but should decrease to really low levels as we get towards bedtime. Right. And as light goes down and our temperature cools, our body goes, do you know what, I'll start getting ready for sleep. Starts to make melatonin, which helps enable us into deep sleep. And melatonin, which some people take to help them with flights, but your body should naturally produce it, is a really, really powerful anti-aging element.
Oh, I was going to say powerful sleep. I do not have a good tolerance for melatonin. I took it on a flight the other day and I thought I was going to die.
Yeah. It's really, really variable. Some people take it and barely feel it at all. And, it's not necessarily a sleep aid for lots of people, but it tries to recalibrate the circadian rhythm. And in this idea that I produce cortisol, let's say 4 a.m. and I start to produce melatonin as the sun goes down, let's say, 8, 9 p.m. That's one of the major reasons people talk about why you have a sleep routine. Why I don't get up one day at 6 a.m., next day at 9. Why I don't go to bed at 9, the next day at 1. Because those hormones won't shift and change night by night.
So I have this terrible hangover routine.
Excellent.
That I want to tell you about because I think you're going to yell at me.
I don't yell at anyone, Grace.
I've heard that the reason you wake up early on a hangover is because of the blood sugar related with alcohol.
Yep.
So it'll wake you up, but also one of the main reasons for a hangover is also lack of sleep.
Yep.
So I, in my little lab that is my bedroom, have tried to combat this by when I wake up hungover, say on a Sunday morning. I can't believe I'm saying this about I've been to sleep at around 3.
Excellent.
and I've woken up at probably around 7, because I'd say I wake up on a weekday, usually around like 6, 7.
Yeah.
And so my body naturally wakes up. Usually on a Saturday, if I haven't gone out, I can have a lie-in. On a Sunday, I can't. And I have taken the time to research and do the scientific backing to see that this is why this is a problem. And so my solution at this point in time, because I will honestly just lie awake for hours thinking, I am so hungover, I could violently vomit right now. And so what I do is I take half a melatonin and I go back to sleep.
Oh, wow. Right. Now.
Until like midday or like 1 or 2 as like a normal person in their 20s who's hungover can do.
Yes.
But I'm so hardwired for this like 6 a.m. wake up and the blood sugar and all of that that I get about 3 hours sleep. I spend the whole day in a semi-state of like sleep and all of this.
Yeah.
I'm not going to recommend it to people, but what I will say is it is foolproof for giving you a good day by the time you do wake up.
That's very interesting.
And I am a pioneer of this theory.
Amazing. Now, I cannot endorse this message. This is the absolute stitch up.
The pits.
I think if I had the solution to a hangover, I'd be living in a wonderful
Well,
home.
I do.
You should add this to the portfolio. I think the challenge, you're right. It's predominantly a sleep issue.
Yeah.
It can be a hydration issue because you've consumed so much of a diuretic.
Yeah.
It can be a blood glucose issue because you've dropped your blood sugar levels to enormous levels.
I also do have a McDonald's before bed,
well,
without
again,
fail.
I can't argue theoretically the blood sugar, and people used to talk about cysteine as being a sort of particular element to help detoxify. And that's why eggs were good in the morning. I think it's cysteine. It's one where you fundamentally are doing something that's horrible to your physiology, right? You're overwhelming it with a toxin. It has to detoxify. There's 2 parts to this conversation. The first part is how old is the individual? Yeah, because fundamentally,
she's 25.
Yeah, that 25-year-old physiology is rock star, right? So we have to bear in mind when people talk about, don't not enjoy your youth. They're largely talking about the resilience of young physiology. Right? You can pretty much hammer it. Of course, there are ripples that will show up later in life. Yeah. But the physiology of a 25-year-old is quite different. So let's imagine I'm turning 45. So my physiology is quite different 20 years on because I've used up loads of my stem cells. My body has given me a chance to reproduce whether I take it or not. And my resources required to get me through adolescence and young adulthood have been partially exhausted. And now I'm on a sort of gradual degeneration until the end of my life. It's positive stuff. Really, I'm so much fun at parties, 40s, 50s, I'm available.
You're on a positive regeneration.
So that you face very different challenges that when you're dealing with people in older stages, they have less resilience in their physiology and they will suffer much more from things that tax them.
So what you're saying is enjoy it while it lasts. Keep taking your melatonin. Keep going out too much.
I cannot, authorize any of the things that and I think fundamentally the melatonin is an interesting one because in many ways you're disrupting then your circadian rhythms. That's quite an interesting byproduct. Yeah. And for most people taking melatonin, they won't find it as a sleep aid. Again, it's a time zone regulation tool. So if I fly east and I want to bring my body clock forwards, then I want my melatonin.
I am doing the same. I'm jet lagged that day.
You are.
Because technically, on Sundays, I just go to America.
And spot on for
in terms of my of my time zone, because I'm going to sleep at 3 and I'm waking up later. So it's just a quick travel.
I hear you. I want the same conversation in 20 years' time to see whether your solutions are placebo, or whether clearly the hydration, the blood sugar control, and resting. The day after you've destroyed yourself, the body can go without sleep, right, for periods of time. We know not concurrently, but not everything has to be balanced and checked and balanced on a physiological basis daily. So I'm designed to go into, not myself, childbirth, periods of enormous reduced sleep. Well, over the moon, I'll tell my wife. But we're designed for periods where we don't sleep well, war, famine, childbearing, periods where we can't get that resource perfect all the time. And there's a little bit of a sort of modern cry to say, I didn't sleep well last night, I'm going to fall over. We can do it. The human body has unbelievable resilience. You see people going on, the sort of SAS programs or going into I'm a celebrity and being taken outside of their domain and realizing we have a huge amount of reserve that we often don't assume we have. But so we can do lots of things on an individual basis. We can do things on a relatively chronic basis. It's when we start to see that sort of progressive degeneration of feeling well, of systems of biology that we say, actually, that needs correction. But the headline news there is, if you sell that product, you probably will get quite a few people buying it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not recommending anything. Personally, this works very well.
It's really interesting.
Just because I also, it's not been based on, I mean, it's kind of anecdotally based on, you know, me, this one person sample size.
Yes.
But what I would say is that this is me doing my best to be a scientist, because when I get home, I know that I need a McDonald's to sober up. Yes. I need lots of water.
Yes.
I often have a daily dose, which is a drink we do at Shreddy, which is essentially a multivitamin drink. So I'm getting my salts back in and my vitamins and everything. Yeah. And then I go to sleep, and then I wake up, and then I go back to sleep because I'm in America for the day.
Yes.
And then I wake up and I'm absolutely fine. And I just know that I couldn't sleep till 12 or 1 just because of my body.
I don't think that you know, the power of sleep, we're seeing it. Right? So when we look at, you know, one of the businesses I'm involved in, it's called Pillar, and we have said really that our products and services will put an equitable effort into recovery as much as movement and nutrition.
If you need my advice, please just
unless we might add that to the portfolio, but you know, you can't really prosper if we think of well-being not as, I mean, the definition of well-being is so floaty. The definition of well-being is a state of being happy, comfortable, or healthy. And actually, it's not even happy. State of being something comfortable and healthy. So it's so floaty that's the reason why skincare is the biggest contributor to it.
Right.
If I think of well-being, saying, look, if I want to feel well, then I need the sum of negative impacts on my physiology to be outweighed by the sum of positive impacts on my physiology.
Right.
You today will do lots of things that your body doesn't like. You'll inhale some pollution. You might eat food that's processed and changes the way your body reacts to that food hormonally or digestively. You might not move as much as you might like. You might apply creams to your skin that have toxins in. These are negative inflections. You might also have some cold water. You know, you might breathe nicely. You might nourish with some particularly good foods, things that support your physiology. And really, we'll look at well-being as those two things are at war. And depending on where those two things net out, plus minus my genetics, will determine whether I feel and function well. So, you know, this is where we struggle with well-being, right? You can't say a single thing is good or bad for you. Right? So is alcohol bad for you? Well, in the context of if that day the negative impacts on my physiology outweighed the positive, then that day my physiology took a step backwards. If that's one day out of 365, it's irrelevant.
I think that's quite a comforting look at well-being as well, when you think of the fact that actually we're pitched a lot of the time on social media this idea of kind of constant improvement, which I love the idea. I love the idea of kind of being able to improve in general over time. But the idea seems quite overwhelming and like big. Whereas if you look at it in a way where it's just those small choices every day that just nets out to be better than it is bad,
totally,
is making that change towards better even physiology, not just the rest of it, you know, the rest of kind of what we think of as improvement. I think that's quite comforting. I think that makes me think, you know what, as long as I'm exercising every so often and doing good breathing and actually have a shower when my hot water's gone for the second fucking time that week, and all of those things, it's just about doing little bits of those things. And actually that to me is less overwhelming than trying to make sure I've had 7 kombuchas,
exactly right,
inhaled some spirulina, and put some cream on my face.
Yeah, and we're being sold single point solutions for a multifactorial system. You know, and again, for my physiology to change, any message into it needs to be chronic. You know, I don't get fit overnight. I don't get nourished overnight. I do it over, you know, weeks. You know, generally 6 weeks minimum, but 3 months. You know, why would I want to see someone back in 3 months if I've done some testing? Because it's got to be that period of time before anything changes. But I think, you know, that also means that we can't say that one individual thing is particularly good for us or bad for us. You know, lots of people have this N=1 approach, and the fact that, let's imagine everything worked amazingly in you, but you didn't have enough of a particular bacteria strain in your digestive system. And that bacteria strain was in a kombucha that you drank. You might drink that kombucha and that might increase your energy levels, or you might not. That might support your immune system. So your body that used to get a cold didn't get a cold. So you go online, you say, oh my goodness, kombucha is the solution to all things, because it was your limiting factor. And what you look at when you go online is people sort of, you know, really evangelically proclaiming that single point solutions have a collective benefit on physiology. They may have done for that individual. But if my gut bacteria is absolutely amazing in terms of its diversity, and of course gut bacteria is predominantly a good thing, but it's amazing its diversity and its abundance, that kombucha just has no impact on me. But the fact that I have got the weakest glutes in Europe, means that I pull a muscle every time I go and do some exercise, that's my limiting factor.
Yeah.
So then I become an advocate for Pilates. So we've just got to be careful that we don't see people transposing their limiting factor N=1 experience as a collective solution to well-being. And I like this idea to take a step back. And I don't see fitness, nutrition, recovery, sleep. I see the sum of positive inflections on physiology, the sum of negative inflections on physiology. And if the individual has a motivation to change, then I want to move the balance of those scales.
So when then consuming a lot of this, for example, social media that's saying, oh, this product's great, this product's great, this product's great, in the most well-meaning way, because, I'll use something and I'll be like, this is the best thing ever. And it might be a hair oil.
Yes.
And I might say, like, this has genuinely changed my hair. And it's well-meaning, all of these things. It converts very well. We know people will buy it.
Yeah.
And how then does that person that's consuming that information become, first of all, more, because it might have the same effect on them, and there's a higher chance that it will if someone has said great versus if no one has said great.
Totally.
How do we become more aware of all of these things and aware of what our limiting factors are in order to consume media like that better?
Yeah.
When we don't have access to something like a health screening?
It's a really great question, great challenge. I think if these products are having a positive impact on physiology, they'll do no harm, right? So we've got to work on the idea, if it's a particular supplement, assuming it doesn't have a sort of toxicity threshold, it will do no harm. A hair oil do no harm. The challenge for an individual to sort of pick this out, I think, is difficult. I think for me, one of the areas I'm in is trying to increase the capacity of the fitness industry to hold better well-being conversations. That is my new purpose, to say, look, how is it that an individual has never had someone help them curate their lifestyle? So if I go and meet anyone on the street and say, right, which supplements are you taking? What's your exercise routine? What's your sleep pattern? What's your relationship with toxins? Do you go BPA free? Are you toxin free? Where does that look like? What's your psychological approach to mindset? Do you journal? Do you do gratitude? And people have sort of created this strange sort of smorgasbord of actions and behaviors based on anecdotal social media here. But no one's ever said, is it effective? And asked, does that work? And I think for me, first thing first, there's a need for a slightly better practitioner to support most people with lifestyle choices. I think we have to bear in mind what most people are looking for are passive 1%ers, not meaningful 20, 30%ers, i.e., we would see, I was in Westfield the other day, nothing against, but IV vitamin infusions. Right? If you're having an IV vitamin infusion for increasing energy levels before you've done your daily steps, before you've eaten a whole food diet, and before you've tried to sleep 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep, that's insane.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're believing the reason you haven't got energy is that you have an inadequate provision of B vitamins and magnesium. And that's the reason you need 15 coffees to get out of bed, versus something that will fundamentally change every single cell in your body, which is moving better, nourishing better, recovering better. So I think people want the idea that well-being can be a passive solution, and products are exploiting that a little bit. If that 1% for you was actually more meaningful, because again, let's imagine I am someone with super low B vitamins and magnesium. I go for my IV vitamin infusion. I may feel better. I'll have a crazy coloured wee, but that's a different story altogether. So we got the idea that it's not a negative thing per se, but it's over exaggerating its likely impact on physiology.
And it can be just a waste of money.
Possibly. And again, I don't
mean specifically for IV. I mean in general. When taking advice, there is obviously the risks that anything will be a waste of money, because even if it's not detrimental, then it's still negligible in its effect to your health.
Totally. And so we look again. We started this with where's that ethical element of dealing with sort of high net worth individuals with a superior healthcare. That model proves that the value of lifestyle impacts on every part of physiology, and we need to go back to that. And for me, the idea that to get a good quality lifestyle, I'd need to go and see a personal trainer. I need to go and see a nutritionist. I need to go and see a sleep coach. I need to go and see a psychotherapist. I need to go and see sort of a toxicity counselor. Doesn't sit comfortably with me. Most people are making decisions based on biased information, on clever, intelligent marketing, and I want people to go back to the roots of how the body works and try and build in across those domains of movement, nutrition, recovery, environment, and mindset a better baseline series of activities. And that isn't sexy or cool, right? But it's pragmatic and it's effective.
Yeah.
And in many cases, we are living a life that is directly in opposition to our physiology.
Right.
And we need to go back a step and say, we're designed to move. We're designed to eat foods rich in nutrients and rich in fiber. And we're designed to chew them and eat them slowly. We're designed to sleep in darkness and sleep disconnected from the world. We were never evolved to deal with half the things that are in the air, in our water, in our foods. And we certainly have it very difficult to think clearly when everyone's telling us we need to overthink on everything. Mm-hmm. And if I take those things, that makes it tough to be well, but there are pretty simple solutions to most of those areas.
So with that in mind, to end, if every guest could change or add or be aware of 3 things to make their lives less stressful and to go from good to great, what would they be?
Great question. 3 things. I'm going to do simple things. Mm-hmm. Management of caffeine, certainly its impact on sleep is pretty catastrophic unless you're very fortunate genetically. So caffeine pre-lunchtime, caffeine after lunch, whether that's green tea caffeine, or coffee caffeine is a big problem. Mm-hmm. But I put caffeine and alcohol use are chemical.
Only in the morning.
So people say, should I then drink alcohol earlier? Yeah. And people used to say to me, Oli, on the next bullet point, can we get my liver function checked? Because I'm wondering if I'm drinking too much. It's like, start measuring your sleep to see if you drink too much. Yeah. So caffeine and alcohol managed against your personal recovery levels. If you sleep beautifully and you wake up refreshed, then part of that isn't relevant. But if those things aren't true, that's the first place to start. Mm-hmm. I think, for me, when I first got into measuring physiology, I thought meditation was a bit left field and a bit floaty. And then when I've seen people adopt appropriate meditation, and how that changes both their breathing, but also the ability to go from thinking about a million things to thinking about one thing, that has a huge collective change on physiology. So the application of some kind of meditation, that could be a mindfulness driven by an app, that could be Vedic meditation, where it's 20 minutes twice a day using a mantra, but something that brings you to a point of stillness and regulates breathing has great value. That could be through yoga, it could be through Pilates. So daily meditation has huge, significant value. And then movement, not necessarily exercise. You can't buy back the impact of daily progressive movement in a 45-minute high-intensity boxing session. Human physiology is not designed to move in a feast and fashion, so feast and famine domain. So regular movement controls blood glucose, controls circulation, will have a huge impact. We see people, proclaiming about forest bathing, walking in nature. Yeah. We see people do barefoot walking, all these things. Movement, whatever format is available to that individual throughout the day, has a huge effect on bringing us out of stimulus into recovery. So 3 simple things.
3 simple things that I think I do none of. Like the movement one, I definitely sit still all day, but I do work out in the morning. Yeah. So I give myself, I do the feasting. I do the feasting in the morning with my workout. And then I honestly do not move throughout the day the large majority of the time, especially if I'm working from home. But on office days, still, my steps, my Apple Watch is yelling at me. Yep. Caffeine, to be fair, I do shout at everyone that caffeine has a half-life of 12 hours, is it?
It can be 8 to 12, depending on how you break it down.
Well, I extrapolate up to up a bound. And I try, if I have coffee after 11 a.m., it will be decaf. Yep. But I understand that decaf still has caffeine in it.
Has theobromine, which is another sort of stimulant in it. So,
but still
it's
keep
much
that
better.
earlier.
Better is better.
Yeah,
right? So,
I definitely wouldn't have caffeine after, say, like 1, 2 p.m. unless I'm going out.
We're different. That's fine.
In America,
that's fine. And it's also pre-workout. It works extremely well for that.
Yeah. And then what was the last one? Meditation. I think I quite enjoy being a very frantic person at all times. Yeah. And I understand the limits of it, but I also don't do anything about it.
I think it's a brilliant point, but not everyone needs everything. I think, and within well-being, we're sort of guilted.
I think none of those. If you've said not everyone
but
needs
let's start back and say, do you wake up feeling refreshed? Are you performing at a high level? Your body composition is where you want it to be. Are you mentally where you want to be? If we take all these things, we start with a subjective story, we haven't got a reason to change. So what we've got to be careful is the absence or presence of a behavior does not define well-being. Mm-hmm. We have to start with, does the individual have an incentive to change? Now that might be for someone mitigating symptoms of disease. That might be for someone improving energy, improving cognition. But well-being is, if I go into a talk and say, who here is healthy? No one will put their hand up because everyone goes, I train a lot, but I don't meditate. And
right.
You don't need them if you don't need them. So what we need well-being to be is a toolkit that you go, right, actually my brain has been a bit foggy the last few weeks. Which area of lifestyle is most negatively affecting my physiology and which area can I boost that positively affects it, and how does that net out? We don't need, to take a behavior and say the absence of it means I'm dysfunctional. We need to bring and add behaviors only when they're valid to us.
That's so interesting. Well, thank you so much. This has been incredibly interesting, and also a personal health assessment, which I have failed.
No, you haven't. You haven't passed.
But thank you so much, honestly. I feel like so many people will take a lot away from this and lots of very actionable things that are very accessible. So really appreciate that. And thank you for coming on.
Absolute pleasure, Grace. Thanks for having me.